you have a Bible, open it up to the book of Joshua, chapter 11. If you don't have one, there are Bibles all around you. So please open those up. I am not I know the other teachers often like to put the verses up. I think that's cheating. I'd rather have you learn to actually find something in your Bible and maybe read it at home a little. Let's start in chapter 11 in the first 5 verses. It says, "When Jabin, king of Hatzor, heard of this, he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimon, and to the king of Achshaph, to the kings who were in the north hill country, and in the Arabah, south of Chinneroth." That's actually the Sea of Galilee. Chinneroth was the way they worded it in the Old Testament. "And in the lowland, and in the Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites, to the east and the west, and the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, which is the people around Jerusalem, the hill country, and the Hivites, under Mount Hermon, in the land of Mizpah. And they came out with all their troops, a great horde in number like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And all these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel." Now, finally, we get the reaction we've been waiting for since Joshua encamped on the eastern side of the Jordan River. It's taken a long time, but now the country of Canaan has awoken to the powerful God of Israel, and they begin to rally themselves around. Remember, after they cross the Jordan, God takes Israel and he strikes Jericho down. And they go from Jericho straight down from east to west through the middle of the country, what I would refer to as the belly of Canaan, through Jericho, through Ai and Bethel on the plateau of Benjamin. And after striking the belly of Canaan, as Jerry so eloquently preached last week, and if you haven't heard his sermon, please go online and listen to it. It was phenomenal. They turn south to strike at the feet, at the whole feet and legs of Canaan in the southern campaign. The only thing left in Canaan now is the head. And Hatzor is by far the head of this whole deal in all of the north. Just a bit about Hatzor. Hatzor is an incredible place. Of my many travels to the Middle East, to Israel and the surrounding territories, Hatzor is one of my favorite places I've ever visited, and it's an awe-inspiring place. Hatzor is one of the great city-states in all of Mesopotamia in both size and influence. It was the greatest city-state in all of Canaan at the time. When they began to dig and uncover the city, they kept going and going and going and going. It's over 200 acres in size, which was massive for that time. And not only is this corroborated by archaeology, but there are many written texts outside of the Bible that attest to the greatness of Hatzor. And one of the striking things about Hatzor is not just the size, but actually where it is, the location. See, Hatzor is actually the front door into all of Canaan from the north, just below Mount Hermon. And so now we have Hatzor, the head, if you will, of all of Canaan, the city-state, with all the surrounding city-states coming together. And as you can see on the map, and if you're listening on the internet from home, you can pull up the notes. Those red lines, there's 2 of them. There's all kinds of gray lines. Those are roads. Like I'd mentioned a few weeks ago, when they took Jericho, that was a key road. These aren't roads, these red ones. These are highways. There were 2 massively important international highways. The most important of the 2 is the one on the left side, and it runs, as you can see, directly through the city-state of Hatzor. This is what we refer today as the Via Maris. It connected the superpower of Egypt with the superpower of Mesopotamia in the north. So you have Israel, the land in between, and not only is it the land in between, you have the road in between, which is the Via Maris that connects them. Hatzor is the gateway to all of Canaan from anybody that wants to come down from the north and even from the south. Not only does it control the international highway, it controls this incredibly fertile piece of land known as the Hula Basin. And the Hula Basin is this flat, it's a little like, when you see a map of California. I don't know if you did this. I don't remember what grade I was in. We took this board in some grade, 3rd, 4th grade or something, and we took clay and we all made a map of California. Do you remember doing this? And then you would paint blue over here where there was water, and the Central Valley was always this big flat spot. That's the part that I did best because there was nothing to do. My mountains were horrible. My coastline was horrible. I don't have an artistic speck in my body other than maybe a little bit of cooking, but I do the Central Valley beautifully. This is what the Hula Basin is. It's just this big valley, and it stands at the foot of Mount Hermon, which is this beautifully majestic, snow-capped, 12 months a year mountain at the top of it. And Mount Hermon drains into the Hula Basin. Hatzor is roughly 10 miles just north of the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Galilee, which is really probably a more accurate term. So anticipating Israel now having struck the belly and the feet, King Jabin, the king of Hatzor, and all the city-states think this guy's coming north. So they begin to rally to prepare. And you're supposed to have the feeling inside like deja vu. This is a little like Goliath and David. This is a massive, massive, massive army that Joshua has absolutely no chance fighting against. We're supposed to have that feel. And they gather at a place, the text says, at the waters of Merom, which is a strange thing because scholars don't know exactly where this is. It's probably not where my map shows you it is, because that's probably too far left. It's probably, if you slide that to the right, it's probably somewhere at the foot of the Hula Basin in the swampy areas of the Hula Basin, or it's up north a little bit, maybe at the foot of the springs that would run in from Mount Hermon. And the text has this comment. It says, "And they began to gather their horses and their chariots." This is a really important key point in this. Chariots, as you know, because you've seen movies with these, what a technology at the time. I mean, the ability to strap a really quickly agile moving, this isn't a big wagon, right? This is an agile piece of war equipment attached to a really agile, fast horse that could run down anybody, and they can turn quickly. There's a flaw with chariots, though. Chariots only work if it's flat and if it's dry, which is fascinating because now you see where Hatzor is, and it's in the Hula Basin. It's a flat area, so this is fantastic for Jabin. This is why he adopts it. But you have to remember, they've been fighting. First of all, this generation came up out of the desert. They come up through modern-day Jordan. They cross, and they begin to fight against the southern Campaign hill country. This is a very craggy, rocky, desert-like, foothill, steep. You can't use chariots. So Joshua and Israel have never seen one before. And some of you might be thinking, well, but they came out of Egypt. But remember, everybody that came out of Egypt is dead. So there is nobody in Israel that has ever seen this technology in their life. So the potential for anxiety and fear and stress is through the ceiling. I mean, run through your mind just the lists of things that Joshua and Israel are coming against and see if they match anything in your life. This is the largest force they have ever come across by a large portion. They've also never come across something this dangerous, like with chariots and horses. This is completely unfamiliar territory. They have no idea where they even are, by the way. They've never set foot in this spot. Only Joshua and Caleb, maybe when they spied out the land under Moses, wandered into Israel somewhere, but it's doubtful they went this far. And on top of all that, there is no obvious solution whatsoever. Let's continue to read. Verse 6 in Joshua 11. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them, slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." If I were Joshua, I would say, first of all, what's a chariot? So Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly, remember that word, against them by the waters of Merom and fell upon them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as Great Sidon. Sidon is basically on the coast, and it's way up north. It's off this map even. It's above Tyre. It was the great port city. They actually built a port out into the Mediterranean where they could bring massive ships in. So this is a key place. And Mizraphoth, Maim, and eastward so far as the valley of Mizpah, and they struck them until he left none remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord said to him. He hamstrung their horses, and he burned their chariots with fire. And Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hatzor, and struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. And they struck with the sword all who were in it, devoting them to destruction. There was none left that breathed, and he burned Hatzor with fire. And all the cities of these kings and all their kings Joshua captured and struck them with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But none of the cities that stood on mounds, this is a weird detail that we'll come back to, did Israel burn. So what is a city not on a mound? What is a city on a mound? It's what we refer to now in archaeology as a tell. So what they would do with a tell, if you've seen these in archaeological sites, they would build a town, they would get destroyed, and it's all rubble, and it's a great foundation, so you'd build on top of that one. And then that one would get destroyed, and you'd build on top of that one. So a lot of times when you are, in a place like Jordan, Israel, Turkey, Greece, when you go to these sites, you can see them from a long ways out because it looks like a big giant anthill. And really what it is, it's strata of city after city after city that were built upon themselves. And so the text here tells us, but none of the cities that stood on mounds, none of the tells, if you will, did Israel burn, with the exception of Hatzor. And all the spoil of these cities and the livestock, the people of Israel took their plunder. But every man they struck with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua. So Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So what happens? Because it's, I love how the Bible writes this. And so King Jabin went out and suddenly Joshua struck him, and then it keeps on. And then, whoa! Was there a commercial break that I went out to get a Diet Coke and came back and, I got no TiVo? The Bible just cracks me up with this stuff. Suddenly he struck them. Wouldn't it be nice to know how? Well, we don't know how, but here's what we do know. God is working with Joshua. He knows exactly what it takes to make a chariot not work. You know what it takes to make a chariot not work? Mud and rocks. So we know he's moving his chariots to a flat, dry piece of ground so they can do battle directly, like we saw in our own country, right? I love these movies where you think, boy, these people could not have been very bright. You get a line, we'll get a line, and we'll just march at each other and shoot, and we'll see who's standing. You ever watch those movies and just think, boy, they really weren't the brightest people ever. Well, that's what it was like with chariots. Well, on the way, before the chariots are on dry, flat ground, Joshua hits them. Can you imagine this? Chariots stuck in the mud, horses can't pull them out, they're tipping sideways, and Joshua mows through them and annihilates these great people with this great piece of weaponry. And the text has two different things. It says two things that I kind of highlighted when I read but stepped over that are really fascinating details in the text. The first one it says is, and he burned Hatzor with fire. This is a weird comment. Like, why do we need to know this? Archaeologists, shockingly, dug out the city of Hatzor and looked at the palace. And if you've ever been to the region of Galilee, you know it's a volcanic area. And what you find everywhere on the ground is basalt. Basalt is a black volcanic rock. It is everywhere. The ancient synagogues were built out of it. The houses were built out of it. The stores were built out of it. And the reason they were built out of it is because it's everywhere. And you can square it off and stack them and make, a nice igloo out of it, right? So this is a strange thing. The palaces of Hatzor were burnt to the ground. The fire was so hot that the volcanic basalt caught on fire. And if you look in that picture on the left, those are stones from the palace of Hatzor. Now, some of the remains are not there anymore because somebody who shall remain mentionless, Jeremy Mann, put his hand on one and peeled off a section of basalt that had stood for 3,400 years until Jeremy Mann, one of your teaching elders, tore it off of its side. And Brian, it was loose. It wasn't that loose until Brian Fury made it clear to me, please share the destruction that this young man, Jeremy Mann, did to the archaeological site of Israel in his deep sin. There'll be a time of communion. I would confess that before you take the bread and the wine today. There's plenty still there. Just those 3 blocks that I took a picture of. The second detail that is even more fascinating to me in the text is this thing that I highlighted where it says, Joshua did not burn any city on a mound, with the exception of Hatzor. This is a fascinating piece of information that God wants us to have, and we don't seem to know why. Many scholars today, and I've read many of their works, feel that these are not real stories and that they were essentially written around 500 BC by Israel to kind of make up their history to explain how they were at the time of this case. And so they look at this and they say, well, there's very little evidence of any of these cities like what Joshua did. One particular book, and he's a bright guy, by the way, and I have friends that actually follow his scholarship, and he loves Jesus, so I'm sorry, but I will criticize him. But Peter Enns, in his book, The Bible Tells Me So, says this: remember those 31 Canaanite towns listed in the book of Joshua, plus 4 other towns on the side of the Jordan River. 16 towns were destroyed according to the stories of the book of Numbers, Joshua, and Judges. Of those 16, 2 or 3, maybe 4 cities show signs of violent destruction at or around the time when Joshua and his army would have been plowing through Canaan. That's it, he says, which is kind of amazing to me. 4 cities out of the 16 completely corroborate the story of Joshua, by the way. That's 3,400 years ago. He says the 2 cities that fit best with what we read in Joshua are Bethel and Hatzor, and perhaps a third, Debir. Well, another city, Lachish, was also destroyed, but probably, I love this, probably 100 years later. The word probably means you don't know, is what that means. I think this is interesting. Hatzor is the exception. Well, and Debir and Lachish, right? And keep going. These cities were burned. Now we get to our little phrase. It says in the text, Joshua only burnt the cities that were on tells, which means you can only use archaeology where a tell exists, because archaeology is the study of strata over time. If there's no strata, there's no archaeology. So archaeology is only one leg of the stool to look at history to see if something actually happened. You then have to turn to other things where there's no tell, because many of the cities that Joshua destroyed were not tells. You have to look at things like material culture, for example, like pottery, or like how did they build their houses, because we know how houses were constructed during different millennia and different centuries. You have to look at things like socio-cultural forms, like the religious shifts that were made in cities. You have to look at language shifts, and a little thing like the study of names called toponymy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. This is a fascinating thing where they actually track place names through centuries and millennia and how they hold their name even through the change of language, like from a Coptic Syriac to Aramaic, for example. And you also have to look at things like, did we get the place wrong to begin with? I taught on this several weeks ago. They forever said the city of Ai was not conquered. Joshua couldn't have conquered it. And then lo and behold, they find out they were looking in the wrong spot. And a mile and a half down the road, there's another place that matches exactly what Joshua conquered. I tell you this to tell you, don't just believe what you read. And when you read some author who's got a PhD and he uses the word probably, you know what that means? He doesn't know. And when somebody says there were only 4 of 16 cities that corroborate the story, my answer is, what are you going to do with the 4 that stand before you? There's my soapbox on the accuracy of Scripture. Verse 16. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country, and all the Negev, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel, and its lowland, from Mount Halak, which raises from Seir as far as Baal Gad to the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all these kings. There was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle, for it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction and receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction and their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war. I want to cover a half a dozen just quick observations of this text, and then we'll kind of wrap it up with a thought. First observation, 7 regions are listed here that were conquered. And this is no accident. We know, many of us that read our Bibles a lot, the 7 is the number of perfection. God is marking this with completion. And he's marking Joshua's life with completion, telling Joshua at the end of all these battles, you're done. The second phrase that hit me is in verse 18, where it says that he was at war a long time, the text says. It's so funny. If you're like me, you read these passages and they're like, wow, that was quick. You know what I mean? It's like if you're sitting with somebody and you tell them a story from your childhood and it takes you 2 minutes to tell it, and they go, wow, that didn't sound too bad. And then they realize it took 14 years to go through that, right? And I think the Bible does that. It's so abbreviated, it dupes us into thinking, like Jerry, in one little passage in one sermon in 30 minutes covers the entire destruction of the south of Judah. I mean, the text makes it clear. This was brutal. And this was a brutally long time. Joshua and Israel knew what it was like to go through hardship for year after year after year after year. They knew intimately what it meant to cling to God, even when they weren't sure if God was there. Some speculate, and I think it's pretty accurate, that this campaign lasted 7 years. I'll never forget when my brother Jeff got married. He was down in seminary in Texas. He gets married. He has a couple of little girls. I think one was 1 and one was 3, and his marriage blew up. and his wife left, and he was just distraught. And if he were here today, he would tell you he was at least half the problem. The problem was, when you have two people that blow up a marriage and only one wants to resolve it, you have a real problem on your hands because it's not going to reconcile. And I have people looking at me right now, shaking their heads, who have been through the tumultuous life of having a marriage split, knowing they were part of that split, but then trying to work it out and knowing the other person's not coming to the party. My brother called me every day, month after month, for years. Just crying, and we'd pray, and we'd talk, and he'd yell, and I remember him telling me a long time after this, when I asked him about the process of going through a divorce, because it's not something I've gone through, but, it's all around us. He said it took him 7 years before he felt like his life came back. And I bet many of you relate with that story. That's what this feels like. This takes a tremendous ability to lean on God. This phrase we keep saying that Jerry hit on again last week, be strong and courageous. Be strong is the emphasis. And it's not you be strong, remember? It's place your strength in the strong one. Place your faith in the one who has been faithful and has the character to come through with you. And the only way to get through this kind of tumultuous difficulty for this long a period of time, this kind of chaos, this kind of grief and pain, is by clinging by the fingertips to a God who will come through for you. It takes guts. It takes perseverance. This is not for the weak of heart. I love how people say, if you got faith, it's just a crutch. Oh, no, it's so much more than that. It's a hospital. The ability to rely upon God takes leaning in on our part. We need strength of mind. When we want to isolate and pull back from friendship, it's exactly when we don't need to do that. We need to be around one another so that people can pour that strength back into us. This is what was going on with these people. A third, the passage says that the sons of Anakim, he destroyed the sons of Anakim, or the sons of Anak, except for these three places, Gath, Gaza, and Ashdod. These were the giants, if you will. You might recall Goliath was a son of Anak. And you also might recall when Moses sent the 12 spies to check out the land. Remember, Caleb and Joshua come back and they're like, dude, look at the size of these grapes and watermelons. We got to go there. And the other 10 are like, that's the worst place I've ever been in my life. You imagine they've got Joshua and Caleb on their shoulders have poles holding up the fruit. It's so huge. And the stories that are coming out from the other 10 guys are, you couldn't drag me to that place, and they're kind of like, eating grapes, going, that's pretty good. And they're like, no, there's giants there. I mean, not giants. I mean literal giants. Massive, massive people. But those 10 wouldn't do it. And their entire generation was lost because they wouldn't move in to trust that God could overcome this. They took an 11-mile journey and turned it into a 40-year death march. And yet, look what the people and Joshua do. I love this. They turn the tide from their previous generation. They were raised by parents who refused to trust God and murmured and complained against God and all the leadership and they just had this habitual lifestyle. And Joshua and the people of Israel said, we're not doing this. This should be great encouragement to you and I. We do not have to live out the same mistakes that our generation before us lived out. Amen? Are we willing, though? Do you have patterns in your life that you go, oh my gosh, I sound just like my dad or just like my mother. Oh my gosh, I have the same critical spirit, or I have the same anger problem, or I have the same addiction kinds of things that I'm wrestling with. You know what? Joshua and Israel had the same problem. You know what they said? God can overcome this, but we have to lean in. This does not just happen, people. They had to go up north. They had to cut west. They had to cross the Jordan River. They had to march around Jericho and conquer Ai and Bethel and all the southern towns in Hatzor. They had to lean in and trust God. But I think this is encouraging. Fourth, in verse 19, it says, no one made peace other than the people of Gibeon. Again, when you read these chapters, they're harsh. Where God just says, just annihilate them. You're like, yikes. But we know from these verses, these are not peaceful people. And if you want more information on that, you can listen to my second sermon on whether God's endorsing genocide. Fifth, in verse 23, it says, and the land had rest from war. What a statement. This is a huge comment when you see this in Scripture. And it doesn't happen very often, by the way. Only a few times. This means, let me say it different. This doesn't mean they were done fighting, by the way. They had peace in the land. The Philistines are still there, by the way. The Anakim are still alive. They live in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. It's not for hundreds of years until King David comes along that the Philistines are destroyed. One of the 12 tribes, when they allot the land, can't get the Philistines out, and they give up their tribal allotment, the tribe of Dan, and they move up north and kill this peaceful people and take a completely wrong piece of land because the Philistines are still there. And so we need to know when we read this statement, and the land had rest from war, it doesn't mean the absence of turmoil. It means something far, far greater than that. It means God has given them this internal relaxation, this internal harmonious sense of relationship with Him and with each other. It doesn't mean done, it means ease of heart. It means when we're in the midst of this just crud storm in our life, can we have that? Is it possible to find our strength in God and to be relaxed, even in the worst of moments? Lastly, there's this weird comment that really rankles people, and I get it, where it says in verse 20, God hardened their hearts, as if God takes strings from His fingers and puts them on the Canaanites and forces them to do bad things so He can kill them all. Because that's how it reads in English. So when we see the word hardened, and it comes up several times in the Old Testament and in the New, we have to ask ourselves, what is God actually doing? You might recall from our study in Romans, if you do, I would be so thrilled, that Paul brings this very thing up, and it originates with the Pharaoh. You might recall Pharaoh, God sends Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh and says, tell him to let my people go. And Pharaoh says no, and Pharaoh sins, and he refuses to let them out of slavery to leave, to go worship God. And then it says God hardened his heart, and then the plagues start coming. And each time after a plague, God would send Moses and Aaron back, and they'd say, okay, you want to let him go now? And he'd go, no. And it would say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This word hardened does not mean to force upon. He's already inclined this way. It actually has a completely different meaning. It means Pharaoh's headed a certain way, and he's sinning against God, and instead of God stepping in immediately and saying, I judge you, you're done, now my people are free, God withholds his judgment for a time. He literally, the phrase is, he stays his judgment. He puts a temporary suspension on judgment so that Pharaoh will have time to change his mind. That's exactly what it means. God is actually holding himself back from judging him and letting Pharaoh run his course to see if Pharaoh, after each plague, will change his heart, and he never does. And then God, after the 10th plague, says, I'm finished. So when we read God harden their hearts, it's actually a super merciful thing because God is withholding his judgment for a period of time to allow someone to flip a switch. I want to close with a thought. In Isaiah chapter 40, the prophet is speaking of God, and he says this, do you not know, Isaiah says, do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he, that should be capital H, right? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. I love that. Who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Wow. And spreads them like the tent to dwell in. Who brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely they are planted, scarcely they are sown, scarcely has their stem even taken root in the earth. When he blows on them, just whew, and they wither before him. And the tempest carries them off like stubble. Wow. There's a deal that happens in life. And let's see if you are anything like me, which would be a frightening thought, but you may have to just admit it. Do you feel like sometimes, because you're just going and going, that there's like a permanence to life? Like this is just going to go like this, like for a long, long, long time. Well, what goes along with that crazy thinking is that our issues are also the same thing. And so when we get in this kind of oppressive time, this grief time, this hard time, this time where it feels like you got an anvil on both your shoulders and it's not coming off. I don't know if you can relate with this, but if you're older than the age of 4, I'm guessing you've already experienced this. Right? Armstrongs? And we get duped into thinking that these troubles are just going to go and go and go with no relief. And then evil kind of steps in, and it does the same thing. So I'll do my best to say this, and I hate crying up front, and then I keep doing it, so it appears that I really like it, but I really don't. But we're just in one of those times where my wife and I literally were in the car. We just started laughing almost hysterically because it's just gotten so absurd. Her brother, who's has mental illness issues and has since he was 20, he's 56. He just went on life support 2 weeks ago, right before I was going to preach, and he's got septic through his whole body. And we were like, okay, you've got 48 hours. If he doesn't come out of it, you got to pull the plug or not pull the plug. And he's been in ICU on life support. And now he's not in life support, but he may as well be because he's on they think maybe feeding tube the rest of his life. And he could move his fingers 4 days ago or whatever, and now all of a sudden now he can't work. I don't know if he's going to make it. And then I shared with you on Mother's Day, this neighbor of mine who's my second mom, and I introduced her as my mother, and she refers to me as her youngest son. She's got 3 weeks to live. As of today would be the last day, but she keeps going, but both her kidneys are done. So each day we go, we visit with her every single day, and we don't know, is that the last time we get to visit with Betty? And we watched all our kids say goodbye to her 2 weeks ago. Just brutal. I mean, just beautiful and horrible, all wrapped up into a candy wrapper, right? And then my dad, I share with you, he's just losing his thinking, and he's got dementia, and it's just really. And then my mom, who's 2 back surgeries in and crippled and trying to take care of my dad and not knowing how to take care of a guy who doesn't know his own grandkids at times. He has a stroke yesterday morning, so then we raced them to the hospital, and I was so neat. I was there this morning with him. I think he knew it was me, but my dad's so sweet and kind, he would light up if a St. Bernard walked in the room. So, and I have no hair, so maybe more like a hairless chihuahua. I don't know what he was looking at. And he can't talk because now the stroke has affected his speech. And so I sat and just read this morning's passage to him and told him I loved him. That was the one reaction I got out of him because he can't talk. And I'd say, I love you, Dad. And he'd go, just like that. I'd be like, oh. So, we're trying to help my mom navigate. What do we do? I don't know what to do. I've never done this before. Right? I don't know if he's going to go quickly or if he's going to last a long time, which is even harder because my mom can't take care of him. So, and then, my other brother, who's been an alcoholic and drug addict his whole life, who now lives with my parents, that I never share with you because my parents are here and I don't want to dishonor them. So this is our secret, and I mean that seriously. Who's, in a psych ward again for the umpteenth time in the last 6 months or something. It's just ridiculous. He can't hold his life together for 2 minutes to actually care for another human being because it's all about him. It's just, my wife and I were in the car, we're going, are we asleep? Is this actually, and I'm not going to ask my wife to pinch me because when she does it, it really hurts. And then I know I'm awake. And this is just life, isn't it sometimes? Yeah, thank you, Carol. You're just tired. But then, there's no time to lay down, right? We got to go. God's calling us to things. I'm driving here going, all right, God, you're going to have to somehow speak to me because I just got nothing. And it comes in waves. It's usually not a problem here, and then life goes, all right, make sure you get through that one. Then before we give you another one, it's like, no, here's just a pitchfork of dung, and it just keeps coming, right? And then we read Joshua 11:23, and the land had rest. Isn't that beautiful? Could that possibly be for me or you? Is that possible? Is that possible that God sees and hurts and steps in and knows? Is that possible? Yes, people. Because if it's not, I'm done. Right? I'm just done. But I'm not. I don't know. You go to the hospital. I said this to my wife too. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to trash your day. Ooh, we need some licorice whips or something. Somebody run out and get some candy. I said to my wife, look at all these people in the hospital. We don't even see them, right? Because in our country, they're not on the street. We push them all into a building and close the door, right, Marion? You deal with this every day as a nurse, so I don't see this. How do these people, how do they do it with no God? It's beyond me. I can't explain it. I just can't explain it. So I wrote these questions down for me, and we'll see if they're for you too. And Isaac, maybe if you guys want to make your way up. But let these just wash into your own soul. What are we wrestling with, first of all, that's too big for us, like the Anakim? What's the giant in your life? You have something at work, a relationship thing, a marriage, one of your kids not going right, health things. What is too big for you to conquer? Or what are we wrestling with that's too unfamiliar? We talked about this a few weeks ago. We're always inexperienced, always. I do not know what I'm doing right now. I got to tell you. So I got to rely on God. I'm the adult navigating my parents, right? And I've been doing it for a little while, but I remember asking Gail Park, some of you will love this. Lynn and I, those of you who know Hap and Gail, they were here for years and years there in Montana, and they've been mentors to Lynn and I for a long time. We were talking about the kids leaving, going off and being empty nesters. And Gail looked at us and she said, I probably should have slapped her now that I knew what this really meant. She said, the window between becoming an empty nester and your parents falling apart is really, really small. We dropped off Scotty, if I remember this right, in college. We pulled out of the dorm parking lot. We got a phone call that Linda's mom was on life support. So we called up Gail and we said, when you said a small window, what exactly did you mean? Because it lasted 3.5 minutes between empty nesting and our parents falling apart. What are we wrestling with that seems like there's no victory possible, like these chariots, that we can't beat? And you're right, we can't. But I know one who can. And what are we wrestling with that has gone on for so long? It now seems so rooted, it's permanent in our life. Marriage stuff, relationship stuff. Maybe things in our own life that we can't seem to get out of our life. And lastly, what are we looking at? Someone else to fix that really we might need to lean into. You know, I've been feeling this way for a while. God's been stirring me, and He really stirred me at the elder meeting the other morning. That our church is in this weird place. Jim Garfield is such an important person in my life. We talk very little, but boy, when he speaks, he's E.F. Hutton. I listen. And he prays for me, and I listen to him. And he was saying to me this morning, we're maturing the body and we're teaching. How do we do it faster? See, that's a good thought. Here's a man not in the beginning of his life. You're at least in the latter half of your life at 92. But he's not concerned about him. He's concerned about us. How do we mature in Jesus? You know, we stand somewhere before, and I'm sorry, Isaac, you keep playing. I'm not done. We stand somewhere between the book of Exodus. Remember, the Israelites, they stood at Mount Sinai, and God said, you're all priests. You're priests. Stop relying on the Levites. You're all pastors now. You're ministers to the world, he says to them. We're somewhere between there and the book of Joshua. And I can't tell, quite frankly, where we are. And I don't know if that even makes sense to you, but God's been stirring me on behalf of you and me. We got to stop waiting for somebody else to do something. What is God putting on your heart? I don't care if it's the second you leave this place and He wants you to pull your car over and help somebody or say something at the Safeway, or if He's putting something big on your heart, like shifting your job, shifting your life, shifting the place you live. I don't care how big it is. Maybe what we need to do is say, I'm not a victim. I'm not relying on what somebody else is going to do. I have the Spirit of Jesus, the very resident master of the universe, the one who created life inside me, people. What is He asking me to do? And we lean in. We lean in. Every one of us. And then we'll be the people of Joshua, not the people of Exodus. Let's pray. Jesus, you are the great leaner-inner. Wow. Just picturing you at Gethsemane, just to your fiber wanting out. And yet you turn to the Father and say, but not what I want, what you want. I want what you want. Give us this heart. And help us help each other to do this very thing. In Jesus' name we pray.